All right. Please bear with me in all of this, because this might be a little bit awkward. Due to the COVID-19 epidemic, it's going to be just me and the camera tonight. I'm very thankful for Jerry for having set everything up so that I could be able to do this without having to go through a very big study in order to learn it. So it's going to take a little while to me to get used to it, but we're going to do this from now on. Now, personally, I have some very definite ideas about contagion and destiny. And some of those ideas are not in agreement with the general view of those things. However, having those ideas, even if they are true, doesn't give me the right to be irresponsible for people who have other views. So this is going to continue. The talks are going to go on in this lockdown type of mode. Now, if you have any questions or any suggestions or any comments or anything like that, we have this address, 99fots@gmail.com. I do check. Before I begin any class, I check for questions or comments or things like that. And that's a way to have some participation when I can't have any now. I do feel I have a responsibility. And that responsibility is to keep these live and fresh expressions of modern mysticism coming out into the world. I realize that I'm a very small voice, and I'm an imperfect one at that. But sometimes when the things are urgent, people are pressed into service, whether they are right for it or not. So this is going to continue on. It's going to continue on because the attitudes of materialism are very strong in the world. And those are the kinds of attitudes that would suffocate spiritual seeking if we allow them to become overwhelming. Now, it's not my intent to combat materialism, because I feel that would only produce more active resistance from its proponent. Instead, this is merely offering an alternative. It's merely stating things from a mystical point of view. And I trust that whoever is listening or watching to these things can judge for themselves. This doesn't absolve me from any errors I might make, and I realize that there will be cosmic feedback, but I have to go on and do the positive thing as well as I can do it. But I do appreciate feedback from listeners. Now, this evening especially, and for the next several talks in this series, there are going to be ideas that are very far-fetched. And it's not the kind of thing that a lot of people like. But please bear with it, because it is important. It's important to me because I can't do what I don't really like to do. I talk about things that are important to me. And so I think it's important to get at these fundamentals. So let's go. To work into the material for the talk this evening, we begin with a correction. And we're going to be doing a lot of that in these cosmogony talks. It's not because of errors that we are going to correct, though there might be. It's due to several other things. It's due to rhetorical technique and as a means to get at the truth of the matter. Now, the rhetorical technique that I'm talking about is more applicable to the spoken word than it is to the written word. There is that quote from Corinthians that says, "If the trumpet sound an uncertain note, who shall prepare himself to battle?" Meaning to say, if you're going to say something, say it clear and strong and boldly. Now, it applies to the spoken word quite a bit. Now, for example, if you have ever read a lecture series from Rudolf Steiner, a thing he didn't want done, you encounter this. You have to make the corrections yourself, though, because he isn't. What often happens is you read a series on some subject and you think, wow, this is super important. And then you read another series and you think that is super important. And after a little while, you begin to realize that there is relative importance, but in making the trumpet sound a certain note, he's making strong statements. And the corrections are going to have to be determined by yourself because you're dealing with something that's long ago and past. Now, something different was being done by Rudolf Steiner than what's happening in these talks. In these talks, we're going to be trying to present a superstructure behind or within the evolutionary creation. And we're going to do that as it's seen by modern mysticism. I won't comment on anything that Steiner did. It stands for itself. And his intent and his quality is determined by his readers. In what is being said in these cosmogony talks, I cannot and do not want to say it is this and this and this. In the first place, I'm not capable of that. Perhaps in the future, or almost certainly in the future, I will be capable. But to do that with going right back to the very beginning of the creation means a very great spiritual advancement. But even if I could do that, if I had the initiations whereby I could see the early stages of the creation and follow it all the way through, I don't think I would do it in such a way saying this is this and this is this. Because that's basically an insult to whoever is listening. It's much better to say, this is as I understand it, and give reasons why it is understood in a given way. Then people can think for themselves and they can judge for themselves. It's more demanding of me to find out ways to be persuasive or to be clear about things. I could just take quotes from various mystics and put them out authoritatively, but that's not respectful. Now, from time to time, bold statements will be made, and there will be a need for corrections. And part of the correction is because of that rhetorical thing of making a strong statement to get a point across and then modifying later. However, some of the corrections are just meant to flesh out the skeletons that are put forth and to give a relative significance. And on some things, like the kind of things we're talking about this evening, it is a matter of being able to home in on the truth. First you overshoot, and then you undershoot, and gradually you come to the point where you get to that spot where you know that something is intuitively true and cannot be denied. Now, we're probably going to be very short this evening because my notes are very short, and that is intentional because I just wanted to this is a hard material. It's hard material for me, and it'd probably be hard material for you if you're even interested in it at all. Now, some of you have been following these talks for years, and several times it has come up that there are two symbols for the absolute: silence and darkness. That is to say, it is unspeakable and it is invisible, even to the mind's eye. It is beyond comprehension. Now that is something that we're going to have to correct. Now, in the talk previous to this, it was suggested that consciousness was one of the things that spanned between being and non-being, whether it was unconsciousness or whether it was waking consciousness. This would be to say that consciousness of some kind, including unconsciousness, had to have persisted or was absolutely eternal, or consciousness couldn't come out of the absolute. To say this is to ascribe consciousness itself as something absolute. And if not, maybe the absolute itself. Now, there are some people who think that consciousness is the absolute of everything. To them, consciousness is the all, and it doesn't require anything beyond itself. There were hints of that when we read from the stanzas of Dzyan. Now this leads to all kinds of conundrums that go of such an order as to ask, is our waking consciousness a dream or an illusion? Is there something about consciousness that is in itself something true? Or when we think we're conscious, are we really conscious? Now, this kind of thinking would hold true when we think of our consciousness. Now, every one of us has probably had the experience of thinking that something was true, and then setting out to prove it to ourselves as true and being convinced that it was true. And then somewhere along the line, some kind of event or someone else outside of us demonstrates that it is not true. And no matter how hard we try to make something true that is not true, we can't do it. So our dream has been taken away, and we have a greater waking consciousness. Now, in ourselves, we eventually, through the experience of life, through the unfoldment of consciousness in life, we come to find some things that are undeniably true, that are intuitively true, and that are absolutely true. They are something that rests on our very being. And when that is the case, we don't have that vague apprehension, or we don't have the restlessness or uneasiness of doubt. It's a very excellent psychological state, and I imagine that a person who had unfolded a very high state of spiritual consciousness would not have any uneasiness. And when we have that kind of understanding of truth or of reality, we can prove it to ourselves, just as we tried to do with the illusory truth that was mentioned just a minute ago. We prove it by demonstrating it to someone or to some consciousness that is not ourself. That is to say, as if there were someone outside of us, a potential ultimate skeptic. And potential is the key word. Someone who is as rigorous as possible. It works in that way we can sometimes find errors in our consciousness. We don't have anything of our insecurity or egoism or anything like that at stake. We can play chess with ourselves, and we can try to overpower our own thinking with better thinking. In other words, non-being or a non-being authenticates and enhances our being, our conscious being. Now, if you will recall, this is something that was inherent in some of the creative myths that we looked at. It was even stated in some of them. And that is that being is authenticated and enhanced by non-being. There's a problem in this, in that the postulated non-being is not absolute non-being. If we try to think of it in absolute, we can never know non-being. We can only postulate something of it. But often that's enough. We postulate it in potential, and through that we come to know something that was previously not a being or not a reality to us. Now, when we talk about things like this, it's very tedious and it's very uncertain. A lot of people feel uncomfortable doing this. But these are things that have been pondered for ages, century upon century. And the understandings, the cumulative understandings about the nature of being versus non-being become more profound as time goes on. It seems like this is never final. Consciousness is enhanced, and it is enhanced by doing this as a matter or a manner of creation. Now, let's look at it in another way. I love Meister Eckhart a lot, so I'm taking a cue from Meister Eckhart. There had to have been a cow in the unconscious absolute for there to be a cow in consciousness. The cow we see around us. It had to have been in the absolute or in the unconscious before it came to be here. Now, if that's the case, the absolute must be packed with all of the cows that have ever been and all of the cows that will ever be. It would be a true chaos, a super chaos. It would be what philosophers call a plenum, which is a fullness. And if we start thinking about sheep and pigs and horses and all of the hundreds of millions of species that exist, and the hundreds of millions of species that will exist, and the hundreds and millions of species that are now extinct. What happens to the cows after death? Now, of course, this kind of thinking is absurd. Some people think that all of this is absurd. But somehow there has to have been a generic cow or a pre-cow before there were specific cows. The cow or the proto-cow existed in potential before in actual, before there were cows in the field around us. Now, stating it this way is all very rough and it's very ragged, but it gives us an idea of potential between being and non-being, and we don't know what else. The absolute is unknown. Now, cows are something that are physically concrete. You can go over and pat a cow on the side, and if you do, as some young juveniles do here, you can tip the cow over. That's a sport that used to be practiced, driving in the country and finding cows and then tipping them over. But this line of thought, or this attempt at an understanding, isn't limited only to concrete cows. It is applied to ideas. Ideas had to exist in potential before we could have actual ideas. So we see that there, in a very strange way, there is a state of potential that is between the non-being and being. And that is a very important state. Now, part of the reason why this presentation is clumsy and awkward is because I am not an initiate seer. There are metaphysical systems of this type that have been put together by people who are deep seers. For example, we have the Vedantins. And the Vedantins have a profound metaphysical philosophy, and it's based on transcendental experience. They talk about things like Prakriti and Molo Prakriti and Brahm and Parabrahm and things like that, where there is a potential out of which something that we know of came. So they speak of potential states that are antecedent to even spiritual states, potential ideas before manifest ideas. Now, understandings of this kind evolve over time. One little thing I forgot. The furnace had kicked in. We'd had noise for a few minutes. So spiritual understandings evolve because everything in the evolutionary creation evolves. And evolution is just another way of saying things get better. Now in the West, not much emphasis is placed on this kind of thing, on this kind of metaphysics as there is in the East. Instead, the focus is more on bringing the spirit into matter in order that we might spiritualize matter, which is our work. Our work, and we're not just here to have a good time or to reach salvation and be done with it. We're here, we have work. We're part of the creation, and the creation is a great work. Now, in the West, this kind of metaphysics is learned. It's learned along the way in initiations. And it comes in other moments. It's sort of a living thing. So had we a very high initiate here of the West that has in his consciousness or her consciousness the evolution of metaphysics from very ancient times, they could give us something that would probably be so difficult we couldn't really understand it. Those earlier systems, as lofty and complicated as they were, did not engage matter. There was even some tendency to eschew matter, which had ill effects on people who adopted in a living way those values. They came even to think that matter itself was illusion, not illusory, but illusion. So if you read the scriptures and the commentaries from those very early days, you see that the golden age, when very spiritual things were the living way of living, they think the golden age was in the past and that we have degraded and degenerated in coming into matter, which is really an incomplete view, but I'm not here to judge their way of looking at things. In modern mysticism, a golden age is probably all the time, but a golden age where a general spiritual awareness and a love of everyone for everyone else is not in the past, it's in the future. When we have redeemed the earth from the gross materialism, and we have transmuted it as well as ourselves into something higher. All right, now we have at least a vague idea of one of the facets of primal creation. We're ready to look at something more specific, but in a way that we hope can help us, in a way that relates to our lives. I don't like these things to be too abstract, even though I have a case of Platonitis and love abstraction too much. Now, as much as we can say about the absolute is that it is everything that is, and everything that is not, and that it is being and non-being, and consciousness and unconsciousness, and possibly something that we can't even conceive of. From this we can say that the absolute transcends being and non-being and whatever. It is an absolute monism, at least as far as we, with our consciousness, can conceive of it. It is a monism absolute. It's more than just unspeakable. Speaking about something apart from it. I don't know how to say this. It's unconceivable of conception in total. If there even is a total, you can't even think that way as far as the absolute is concerned. For example, have you ever tried thinking about something beyond being? Something beyond consciousness and unconsciousness? It silences you very quickly. Now, from both the early myths and the mystics from whose experiences those myths arose, we learn the same thing as modern mystics find, that there is a spontaneous awakening of conscious being. Now, even in our little lives, we experience something analogous, but in a very small way. Every morning, we awaken from the unconscious state of sleep. If we turn our attention to our conscious being, we can say I can see no reason for there to be a limit to my consciousness. My consciousness just is. No doubt about that. Everything that exists to me exists in my consciousness. Now, when we wake up in the morning, especially the coffee drinkers, before they had their first cup of coffee, can be aware of little things within the consciousness, whether they're still tired or whether they're hungry. But those are things that are within consciousness and not limitations of consciousness. Now, from our experience, we know there are times that we are more conscious than other times. But it is still simple consciousness. It's universal. It's, I don't know how to say, I don't want to say uniform, but it's omnipresent. From this, we're very apt to think that consciousness is itself a monism, that it's just one thing. We say things, if we're philosophers, we say that everything exists or subsists in the consciousness of the one universal spirit. It's a pretty nice thing to say. It's positive, it's comforting. And some even claim to experience conscious unity throughout everything. I'm not going to doubt somebody having that kind of experience. I'm not going to doubt that kind of consciousness. There's something about it that has a ring of truth, and there's a metaphysical logic about it, and it appeals to the intuition. You intuitively know that you're conscious and that this consciousness is universal. Just like we said earlier, that you come to some truths and you come to them intuitively, and you can't argue with them. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't the possibility of doubt or the possibility of uncertainty about consciousness or in consciousness. The unconsciousness of sleep is not as deep and it's not as prolonged, which brings us into a difficult subject, because we remember that we were conscious yesterday. Now, if we think that our consciousness is a universal, that should shake us, that we don't have the consciousness between yesterday and today. In fact, that is often a big spiritual experience. If a person drinks to excess and passes out, and then consciousness is revived and they realize that they lost it, and they lost it completely, and they don't know what happened there, that is enough to change someone's life. That they won't go back to anything that'll take their consciousness away. Some people even believe, and I'm not going to doubt them, that they have a memory that spans the time between rebirth and rebirth. But ultimately, in the universal, ultimately there is doubt. Now, an atheist is honest when the atheist says that he or she believes there is no consciousness after death. Now, that's a fearsome thought to most, and you would think that would shock most into a different kind of life from atheism, but it doesn't always work that way. And if we think about little children at a certain age are afraid to go to sleep because they're going to lose consciousness. And that isn't a matter of maturity. It isn't a matter of sophistication, because they're pure and they love life. But they have, I would guess, what you would call a profound metaphysical doubt in innocence, without any sophistry to lead one way or another. So ultimately, there is an awareness of unconsciousness. And with that, there is an awareness of the possibility of not being. We're not talking about this just in terms of death. We're talking about this in as close to the absolute as we can get. Now, this awareness is not like the knowledge of things. It's more like a vacuous foreboding. The awareness of the possibility of non-being sharpens our awareness of being, and we more keenly appreciate it, and we put ourselves into it. Not that we're insecure, but we realize, wow, this is really something wonderful to be consciousness. I won't take any kind of drug of any kind because it interferes with my consciousness. I'm not free to choose my own consciousness. Now, we experience this in little things that we've all had. But the upshot of this is that consciousness in being automatically means there is a dualism with unconsciousness. Now this is a very tricky way of understanding, but if we are living in consciousness and we realize that there are things of which we are unconscious, or that there is a state of which we are unconscious, that automatically means that there is a dualism between the consciousness and the unconsciousness. And we internalize that. We can't avoid that. So consciousness means dualism even in the universal spirit. So thus far, as we look at things, we have a monism. And that monism is in the absolute, but that we can't even fully comprehend. Some people can't even comprehend the monism or the universality of being in the highest states of spiritual awareness. So it's a necessary dualism. Now, this is something that we experience. We don't have to study these recondite metaphysics. It's something we can experience regularly. we recognize that we know something, and when we come to know it, by that very same act of knowing it, we discover that there are things that we do not know. People who instruct, teachers, realize that in giving instruction, they have to know what they're doing, and when they're working at knowing what they're doing, they realize there's a whole lot they didn't know. There's a whole lot that there's students might question them on. That happens all the time. Now, we humans are in nascent stages of awakening consciousness. And we are at different degrees of awakening. And we even have different flavors of consciousness. Consequently, we have differing ideas about dualism. For example, if you have something like a materialistic existentialist, they think that to even question anything about dualism is absurd. Or if we look at that ancient creative myth with Prajapati in his consciousness was lonely. And in his loneliness, he realized that there's something, there was a necessity for something beyond himself. And that is what led him to create. Now, most of us are children of fire. We are children of Cain. And we are the kinds of ones that don't just take things that are given to us. We seek answers, and we seek answers with everything we have. That's what the mysteries are all about. Somebody that is a child of water or a child of Seth takes a mystery and worships it as a mystery, not as something to solve. So there are different kinds of temperaments about it. Now, we are spiritual aspirants or aspirants seeking unified consciousness with the universal spirit. We want to be one with it all. And if we're conscientious about our lives, we realize that we do a lot of things that are out of step. We don't want to do those things anymore. We want to live in perfect harmony and accomplish what is trying to be accomplished in the creation. So we question the mysteries. And when we do so, we do that with a divine creativity. Now, like the child that doesn't want to go to sleep, we want to reach and maintain complete consciousness, and we give ourselves to that as fully as we possibly can. And to do that, we postulate hypotheticals. We postulate them creatively, whether it's a hypothesis in a scientific laboratory, or if you're trying to understand somebody, are they doing this for this reason? Or is this what I feel in my inner being in terms of art, something I would like to share beauty about? So this is what the evolutionary creation is all about. We're back to that potential again, and the hypotheses in that potential. This is what evolution or the evolutionary creation is all about. So we talked about proving our existence by postulating someone outside of ourselves who is simply and completely skeptical, and proving it to them in such a way that it is indubitable. And the strange thing is that in that our understanding of ourselves is enhanced. By a hypothetical being that doesn't exist, our real being becomes sharpened. And we can do that a lot. And that kind of activity is creative. It is postulation, or it is hypothesizing in potential. Now, we saw that a cow had to exist in potential before a cow could exist in actual. And potential, we said, and we've said it along the way, but perhaps this is a little bit clearer about it. We said that potential is what stands between being and not being, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the known and the unknown, between spirit and we don't know. So it behooves us to examine some things about potential to get to where we want to get when talking about the evolutionary creation. This might be under an hour. Among writers, and the critics of writers, there is a belief that every book written is to some degree autobiographical. Even a scientific paper is autobiographical in what is chosen to be written about. It indicates the character of the person who is writing the paper. Now, this holds true in a reversal of the principle of analogy. The principle of analogy goes as above, so below. So instead of saying as above, so below, this is one case where it is valid to say as below, so above. Doesn't apply always in every case, but in this case it does. So the initial macrocosmic creative cause is also autobiographical. It has to be, because there's nothing else it can draw from other than its own selfness. Now, pertaining to this discussion, the duality inherent in consciousness being relative to unconsciousness and being to non-being carries into potential. That is to say that the internal dualization that we have between consciousness and unconsciousness, we put that into our creation, so that potential is itself dual. It's because it has to be autobiographical. Now, from this we can say that there is a pole of potential. And generally, as far as I know, in all seeking of any kind, even materialistic, there are two dimensions of the pole of potential. They are time and space. Now, please, please, please don't limit your view of time and space to the way they are looked at by science today. Those terms, as they are used by science, are valid. We have tremendous understandings of the material world by that view of space-time. In fact, I call it space-time instead of time-space. And that's to their credit. That means they understand that it is also a pole. Now, at that pole of potential, there is a vertex or an axis. the center of being, we call it in mysticism. Now, when we hear words like poles and vertexes, we're likely to think about graphs and things like that from math classes. Those kinds of things are true. But again, what we're talking about, the reality, is much more profound than that, and there's much more to it. In this polar potential, creation becomes manifest. And the stuff of creation, both the creator and the created, the stuff of that is called in modern mysticism cosmic root substance. We've mentioned it before in these talks, but now we can see it a little bit sharper. We have always likened it to mathematical space. And mathematical space is comprised of unlimited contiguous points with only position. No size, no substance, no shape, only position. This goes right back to Pythagoras. He saw it this way, and he probably saw it with acute first-hand knowledge. Now, in the density of the contiguity of all of these points, there is matter. Different kinds of matter, not just this stuff, but different kinds of matter. And that is along a pole whereby in the subtlety of cosmic root substance is where there is spirit. Spirit which is ultimately subtle. So we have a spirit matter pole in a space-time or time-space pole. And the center of all of them is, again, the center of being, which is probably the center of all of those points. But we don't want to get into that now because I'm not prepared. I haven't put things together coherently enough to do that. Now, all of the activity of an evolutionary creation is carried out along the spirit-matter pole. And it's carried out through the center of being, no matter what creative tools are used. Now, you got to remember that in this elucidation, if it is even an elucidation, this is all extremely simple. This, in its reality, is extremely deep. And it goes well beyond my current capacity to grasp things that deep. And this becomes awfully dry. It becomes awfully abstract. But the reality, the experience of spirit, is glorious. It's just a little taste of it, and it's glorious. So when we're speaking about divine spiritual being, it should be enough to be able to awe us and to overwhelm almost even the most advanced of us. To even, though some of my greatest joys in life are the moments when I contemplate this in order to objectify it, to be able to say at least a little bit about it. I have nothing but gratitude for being able to touch on these things which are so fundamental and so rudimentary and at the very heart of spiritual being. I have nothing but gratitude, and unfortunately it's very hard for me to carry something like that into a talk, but this is the stuff of adoration. And it would please me a tremendous amount if it helped people to turn their consciousness in such a way that it became a matter of adoration. Not the material of the talks, but the reality. Now, because we are conscious of these three states, being, not being, and could be, that is actual, potential, and unknown. This gives us a threefold consciousness, just as the awareness of being and not being, when internalized, gave us a dualism that the unity, the oneness of spirit automatically led to a dualism within itself. The desire to know the unknown that brought an awareness of potential, of taking something from the absolute and being able to bring it into conscious being. That trinity or that triune state is also internalized. So what we're talking about is that we have a threefold kind of consciousness. Now, the way we're talking about it tonight is extremely primitive. We're going to talk about threefold consciousness in a lot of other ways. But we can see that even in our hypotheses, because once we have the realization of the potential of a hypothesis, when that is internalized and we have this threefold nature, the things we hypothesize become threefold. Now that's a tricky metaphysical argument, but that is indeed what happens. So we have, this goes by the principle of analogy. It says in the principle of analogy, what has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Meaning to say that once the spirit has become aware of the threefold nature of being and non-being and could be, when that is internalized and the spirit creates, it carries into the creations. Now we can take a tally. We have a threefold spirit. And in the manifestation of our hypothesis, which in our case is enlarged, the evolutionary creation, we have a threefold kind of matter. So we have threefold matter, threefold spirit, and all of this through the center of being. That adds up to 7. Now, when you look at the scriptures of all the great religions of the world and all the varieties of mysticism, they find that in terms of creation, beyond the 1, the 2, and the 3, as said in the stanzas of Dizyan, there is the sacred 7. Now, in the course of these talks on cosmogony, we are going to encounter more 7s than you care to deal with. It'll be 7s upon 7s. And for that reason, I wanted to do this talk tonight so that you could see that the number 7 is not just a superstitious thing. It is fundamentally necessary in the consciousness that we have. Consciousness leads to dualism with unconsciousness, and the possibility of bringing unconsciousness into consciousness brings to threefold consciousness. And that projected into our potential gives us sixfold, but it is that one center through which we focus, so we had something sevenfold. Now, just as there are many other ways that we could talk about threefoldness, there are many ways that we can talk about sevenfoldness. Now, this is a symbol that is most commonly used and not very well written. It was done in haste. But the what is called the Star of David, the symbol of the macrocosm, is threefold spirit, threefold matter, and the center of being. Now, this is a This is spoken of in different ways. For example, Madame Blavatsky talks about it in the orientation of a human being is sevenfold. There is to the left, to the right, in front, in back, above, below, and the center of being. Good, that took exactly 1 hour. Thank you very much. It's been fun, and I hope it's been helpful.